Frederick Hitz was the Inspector General of the CIA from 1990 to 1998. He was with the CIA much longer than that, but that was a very senior position that he had. As I recall, that was a presidential mandated position, was it not, Fred? He worked for the CIA many years before that, and there is a full biography of him on the sheet that I hope you have. It's out in the hall if you want to. I'll bring some in so that you can look it over, but please read that. Fred graduated from Princeton University before he went with the agency, and since his retirement, he has taught, or is actually teaching, both at Princeton and at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. So we're so happy to have Frederick Hitz with us. I'm a little upset at Fred. For about 5 years, I've had a project in mind I wanted to do. I wanted to take some spy fiction and parse out of it tradecraft practices and compare it with reality. And Fred did it first. It's a marvelous little book published by Vintage Press. It's called The Great Game, The Myth and Reality of Espionage. And Fred has brought several copies with him and will sell them at a slight discount after. Now, but it's a great book, and I hope you all have get your airfare home. If you don't buy, he walks. It is a great book. It, along with all of the other books over here, are written or edited by people who have presented on our panel over the last 2 days and today. So, on behalf of the university, the David M. Kennedy Center, we're just delighted to welcome you all here, and we'll turn the time over now to Frederick Hitz.
Thank you, Stan, and this has turned out to be a little bit of a home and home, because as we were trying to make the final arrangements for coming out here, I learned that Stan and Vicki were going to be in Charlottesville at a conference that the Navy was sponsoring, and so we had a chance to get together there and get a little glimpse of Virginia springtime, which is a treat. Am I not close enough?
You're doing fine, but I made one of those fatal mistakes, Fred. Would you introduce your family members?
Oh, I will. I was coming to that.
Certainly want them to meet Mary.
Yes, I wanted to do that. Mary Buford is sitting there like Madame Defarge at the execution, doing a needlepoint in honor of our grandson, whom we're going to spend the weekend with, who is 9 months old now. I'm probably a month off there. 10, 11. Okay. Well, I'm getting there. And my nephew and godson, Alec Bocock, who lives in Salt Lake City, is on Mary's right, and my daughter and son-in-law, Eliza Hitz and Randy Hartwig, are beside them. So I'm delighted to have them in the audience. And believe me, if I don't get this right, the ripe fruit will start throwing in from the audience. As Stan said, I had the pleasure of putting together a book a couple of years ago dealing with the great works of spy fiction and trying to compare them with the real thing as I had experienced it in the service. Frankly, what I was looking for was a syllabus for a freshman seminar. I was then teaching at Princeton, and it just seemed to be an interesting thing to look at. And as I taught it for a couple of years, I felt I could work it into a book. And I appreciate Stan's kind endorsement of it. But I want this morning to sort of continue the thread of that particular, of the argument that underlies that book, aside from just the fun of these passages, and that is that the truth of espionage is stranger than the fiction. And I want to make apologies to Wesley Wark in the audience, who I think quite rightly took a slightly divergent view of spy fiction in his remarks yesterday, and made the very good argument that in many spy novels, it is rather the pretense of realism that drives the argument. That is, perhaps the verisimilitude would take away from the literary appeal of the book. The plot wouldn't go as smoothly, so there's a very real reason, perhaps, why spy fiction doesn't follow exactly the pattern of human behavior. But I have a slightly different angle on that, and that is that it's very hard to capture in fiction all of the ways in which human nature manifests itself. And the spy stories that I want to talk about this morning, seems to me, illustrate that. The first, and trying to keep in with our relationship between modern media, in my book I talked a little bit about Robert Hanssen, but that was before this remarkable movie, which I recommend to you all, was produced, called Breach. And Breach concentrates on the relationship between Hanssen and his FBI assistant. So it really doesn't give you the full range of ways in which, among other things, Hanssen hurt the national security of the United States enormously, but also was himself a very strange figure. Robert Hanssen remained a devout, practicing Opus Dei Catholic throughout his period of spying for the Russians, godless communism. By his own telling, he disapproved of the Soviet system and espoused a highly conservative political viewpoint at the time. At the time, he was delivering to the Soviets, for money, plans to bug the new Soviet embassy on Mount Alto in Washington, or the techniques used by the FBI to keep track of the movements of Soviet diplomats in New York. He was an IT specialist. He was brought into a lot of intricate FBI machinations that involved computer equipment far beyond any notion that compartmentation would have argued against, just because he had the skills. He also revealed to the Soviets the names of many spies working for the U.S. against the Soviet Union, such as Adolf Tolkachev, who was a very productive spy in the R&D area, a spy code named Top Hat. He and Ames gave his name away. And among other things, he warned a spy working for the Soviets against the United States, Felix Bloch, who was a foreign service officer serving in Vienna, that the FBI was onto him, and the Soviets immediately cut contact with Bloch, and he was on the run. He covered up his tracks. How could this be? How could this seemingly straight-laced, devout Midwestern son of a cop, he was from Chicago, betray U.S. intelligence secrets to a regime he openly despised? And he always talked about his revulsion at the Soviet system. A filmmaker has sought to get at some of this in Breach, now out, dealing principally with Hanssen's relationship with his office assistant. Chris Cooper, and I had seen Cooper before in some movies, but I hadn't ever gauged his capabilities. He did a terrific job. And it was a hard part to play because Hanssen was really quite a strange bird in the Bureau, because he was very much unlike most of his fellow street agents. He wasn't a backslapper, or as he would describe it, a politician. He wasn't on the make to get a better job. He possessed, as I said a moment ago, uncommon skills in the information technology field, and that kept him at the center of a lot of the major happenings in the Bureau's toughest investigative cases. And ironically, and here is where truth is stranger than fiction, ironically, it kept him at the center of the investigation, the effort to find the mole in the FBI after it was concluded in 1994 that Aldrich Ames, the case that my office, the Inspector General's office, had looked into in 94, could not have been responsible for all the counterintelligence losses the U.S. government had suffered to the Soviets in the early 90s. But he seemed to know he was never going to be promoted to one of the top jobs in the Bureau, and he, of course, resented it. He was still the black-suited, back-office Dr. Doom and stood out in the Bureau's locker room culture as not one of the boys. In addition, as the film explores briefly, Hansen had a taste for kinky sex, videotaping his wife Bonnie and him having sexual intercourse for the titillation of Hansen's oldest male friend, Jack Hoschauer, then working in Germany. And boy, what a nasty bit of business, as counted in David Wise's book Spy, that circumstance, because Hansen's wife, Bonnie, was a devout Catholic. It was the reason he became a Catholic. He'd been raised a Lutheran. And she bore him several children, and she was faithful to him throughout, and still is, still visits him in maximum security prison somewhere in Colorado. He also befriended and showered gifts on a Washington stripper whom he met at a dive near FBI headquarters. So he was quite a bizarre individual. In fact, Hansen spied for the Soviet Union for a combination of reasons. He needed the money they paid him to meet the cost of his children's expensive Catholic schools. He wanted to show his colleagues that he was a lot cleverer than they thought he was, and he should have been properly recognized for his skills and promoted. He took great satisfaction, as the film notes, at being named the man in charge of finding the FBI mole when he was, in fact, that mole. He appeared to like the game of espionage for its own sake, and that's a whole area of inquiry that I engaged in my book. Once you get through all the reasons, ideology, sort of the normal reasons, ideology, revenge, money, ethnic solidarity, for many of the most successful in quotes, spies, both Soviet and our own, there appears to be a love of the game for itself. It's almost a Walter Mitty-like fantasy world that they enter into. They know things that nobody around them knows. To give you a good illustration of how that works in practice, some of you might read the autobiography of Kim Philby. And that book, written in 1968, is in Moscow, long after he had defected, is laden with irony. He will talk about important Western secrets that he became a party to, and he would say, and the difference was those people who were giving me this information and knew only one part of the equation. They didn't know to the use to which I was going to put it, namely give it to the Soviets. Finally, as I learned from Dr. David Charney, a neighbor of ours in Alexandria, Virginia, who was Hansen's court-appointed psychoanalyst, Hansen possessed an enormous fear of being perceived by his wife and family as inadequate, a failure. He longed to be the financial and professional success his deprecating and abusive father wanted him to be. His father, as I say, was a Chicago cop. He was an only child. His father wanted him to go to medical school, pushed him, ridiculed him with others, with Hansen standing by, and never accepted the fact that Hansen just wasn't going to follow that path. He studied dentistry and it didn't pursue it, then went and studied and got a business degree. Hansen feared, according to Dr. Charney, that he had really not measured up to his responsibilities. I believe Chris Cooper caught some of this in Breach, but we shall probably never know the full extent of Robert Hansen's reasons for betrayal, just as the film fails to capture his declared state of relief at having been apprehended. "What took you so long?" he apparently inquired of his FBI captors when he was arrested. When you read the final messages, Ramon, That was Hansen's cover name that he used with the Soviets in his correspondence. Hansen had insisted, unlike Aldrich Ames, that there would never be a personal meeting between him and his Soviet control. All of the dealings would take place by what are called dead drops, where messages, in this case, in Hansen's, when it was on Hansen's side, reports of what was taking place in the United States, wrapped up in a garbage bag and deposited under a rock in a state park, Fairfax County State Park, and the Soviets would pick it up and leave a bag full of money for Hansen. So he used the name Ramon, and he remained of the view that the Soviets never really did know who he was, although given the access that he had and the very capable case officer that was running him at a distance, Victor Shakashin, it's highly likely that, number one, that he was a bureau official, but number two, it had to be somebody that had this technical expertise. So I'm not sure all the precautions he took were successful. But when he wrote to his Soviet control, and you can read this in the documents that were filed in the U.S. District Court in Alexandria when he was arrested, you can sense his malaise. He wonders if the Soviets appreciated the difficulty of his assignment and understood the effort he had put in trying to serve them. It's very difficult to capture in film something like this, and equally hard in the literature, the physical and mental toll that is involved in the role-playing and the demand of living several lives. That is the fate of a spy like Hansen. Now, so I recommend that film highly. I think they've captured a lot of what was going on, but maybe not the ultimate question. Some of the critics of film have pointed out that there was a very poignant irony involved in Hansen as the head official in the effort to search for the mole, because for a long period of time, following the trail of Aldrich Ames, a CIA official who had betrayed his trust, the Bureau thought that the mole, the existing mole, the mole who had to continue to exist because what Ames had done didn't cover it all, was also a CIA officer. And the agony of Brian Kelly, who was the career counterintelligence officer, a very quiet, very decent Vermonter whose life was made hell during this period of time as the Bureau kept closing the circle on him and saying, you had all the access to these other cases. It's got to be you, and the reason we don't have any evidence on you is because you're so clever and you know how to conceal your tracks so well, which was just an impossible argument to meet. It's just remarkable that Barry Kelly, who's still on the rolls, still working in the counterintelligence field, doesn't have any bitterness. But the only reason that had put him in the magic circle of suspicion was that he happened to live not far from Hansen and ran in the park that Hansen used for his dead drops. In any event, Hansen was apprehended, and not as a consequence of investigation, but as a consequence of information that the United States bought from a source in the Soviet Union for $7 million. The second current example I want to cite of truth outdoing fiction, and I don't know whether it's in Provo or in the Salt Lake area yet, but it will come, is the remarkable German film about the East German secret police, East German intelligence service, the Stasi. And it's entitled Other People's Lives, and I recommend it to you highly. Lives of Others. Excuse me, I get that screwed up. Thank you. It's just won an Academy Award as the best foreign film of the year. In my view, this film deserved every honor it's received. I suppose unless you have lived in the smothering, hypocritical arms of a totalitarian police state, you can't imagine the extent to which the bureaucracy, and in this film, the spy bureaucracy, dominates and deadens the life of its citizenry. Exposed brilliantly in Lives of Others is the manner in which the governing party officials and the security police serving them intervene in any activity, mundane or artistic, that they choose, ruthlessly enforcing a loosely defined standard of socialist propriety to favor some and punish others. While viewing the film, I thought I was seeing a visual recasting of Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. In the saturnine way, the Stasi chief sought to curry favor with his repugnant Central Committee boss by manufacturing evidence of disloyalty against the literary protagonist who had snaked the boss's girlfriend. That was what was involved here. The party boss had seen this well-known literary figure become very close to an actress on whom he had imposed his will, and wanted to develop evidence of disloyalty in order to discredit him, even though he was a well-known public figure in East Germany at the time. It was the banality of evil all over again. That becomes even more poignant when one learns that the powerful acting performance put on by the disillusioned Stasi technician who resists the effort at framing the writer and his mistress was himself, in real life, denounced to the Stasi by his wife. So take a look at this guy. He's bespectacled and calm and rational. He makes up his mind that this is not what he signed up to be a police officer for, to frame innocent people for the benefit of a party boss's romance. And what makes the film so powerful and persuasive is the contrast between the robotic efficiency of the East German secret police, manifested by the squadron of lab-clad technicians marching in with warrants to bug the apartment of the writer in order to manufacture evidence of his disloyalty to the state, with the sleazy corruption of the officials sworn to protect it. That's what makes that technician's determination not to go along so admirable and unusual, even if he's sentenced thereafter to pull a postman's cart as a penalty. That's what happens to him. Don't get really fired from the civil service in a state economy. You just get a lesser job. Power without accountability corrupts, as we know. But lest you think that this outfit, the East German secret police, were a bunch of domestic-oriented thugs, which they appear to be in this movie, they had enormous success in the international espionage front, spying on West Germans, many of whom had ties to East Germany. Obviously, some had escaped to West Germany through the underground in the U-Bahn in Berlin in the early post-war years. Others had come in other ways, and the family connections were exploited very cleverly by the Stasi to continue to bring in information from the West. And as a sort of a footnote for our own example, in CIA, we had a number of East Germans, which in time, as the country came together and East Germany went out of existence, we learned that they were all doubled. In other words, these were individuals who had been dangled to us, they were sent to us by the Stasi, and we're still reporting to them. So they had ability. Third, I want to talk about a true story that has not yet become the subject of a film or a book, although the central figure, Valerie Plame, has reportedly sold the film rights and plans a book. The story about the outing of Valerie Plame as a CIA undercover operative. This story is so bizarre that neither film nor a Principles After Action account, I'm sure, will do it justice. The Plame case has become a very complicated issue since syndicated columnist Robert Novak reported in the Washington Post in the summer of 2003 that the CIA had recommended that a former U.S. ambassador, Joseph P. Wilson, be sent to Niger, a landlocked country in the center of Africa, right part of the Sahara Desert, report discreetly on whether the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein had purchased yellow cake uranium from that country to contribute to Saddam's effort to build a nuclear weapon in the run-up to the Iraq War. Ambassador Wilson did indeed make the trip, found no evidence that Niger had sold or planned to sell yellow cake to Iraq, and severely criticized the Bush administration afterwards in a New York Times op-ed piece for seeking to justify the war on that basis, thereby making Vice President Cheney and some of the president's top advisors very angry indeed. Novak had further inferred in his column that the reason CIA had recommended Ambassador Wilson for the trip was that his spouse, Valerie Plame, worked at CIA and had volunteered him for the mission. The undercurrent of Novak's column was that since CIA did not believe that Niger had supplied Saddam with nuclear feedstock like yellow cake for his nuclear weapons program, and that his nuclear bomb-making efforts were still at a rudimentary stage, the dispatch of Wilson was an effort to support the White House's view of the story, i.e. that there was yellow cake going in, and to disregard the facts. This might have gone down as a typical Washington political food fight, except that it turned out that Ms. Plame was not only a CIA official, but a clandestine one, a spy, who had never been acknowledged as CIA and whose entire career had been under non-official cover. She was a graduate of Pennsylvania State University. She'd gone right into the agency after she graduated and had a long and successful. She wasn't Mata Hari, but she did a good workmanlike job in all of her positions, and she had never served in any other capacity but as a non-official cover officer overseas. This raised the more serious issue that under the Agent Identities Protection Act of 1980, sorry, we're going to get a little technical here, passed in the Reagan administration to prevent the intentional outing of undercover CIA spies by dissidents and disgruntled former CIA operatives who knew they were spies and wanted to put them out of business. Such an intentional outing, if done with foreknowledge that the CIA operative was undercover, is a violation of criminal law. Now, I go through that because in order to make a case, there's some in this room that worked on the Agent Identities Protection Act, as did I. You had to pass muster with the ACLU and others who were worrying about suppressing publication unduly. So in order to be guilty of the crime of outing a CIA officer unlawfully, you had to know that the officer served undercover, know that the government made an effort, i.e. classifying it, to keep that information from being public, and doing it intentionally with that foreknowledge. The fat was in the fire. And to get to the point, the Justice Department recused itself from the criminal investigation into the circumstances of Ms. Plame's outing and appointed a special counsel, Patrick Fitzgerald, then the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, i.e. Chicago, to conduct the inquiry. Now, one of the splendid ironies of the latest Washington food fight, i.e. the dispute over whether the president properly discharged U.S. attorneys in the last bit. In fact, I learned in the paper this morning, to my horror, that the young man testifying before the Congress today, Mr. Sampson, is a BYU graduate and also a University of Chicago graduate, so how that goes down we don't know. But one of the interesting bits of email that has surfaced in the course of this investigation is that Fitzgerald was not ranked among the top U.S. attorneys as they were going through this business of who should go and who should stay. And that's pretty hard to believe, because not only was he able to prosecute this case extremely carefully and with success, but he had also been the lead attorney in the trial of Ramzi Youssef in 1993, the bomber of the first World Trade Center attack. Mr. Fitzgerald moved deliberately, but concluded that although there did not appear to have been an intentional outing of Ms. Plame, with knowledge that she was an undercover CIA official, and thus no violation of the Agent Identities Protection Statute, there had nevertheless been an effort by the Vice President's Chief of Staff, I. Louis Scooter Libby, to lie about his knowledge of who outed Ms. Plame and when, and to obstruct justice in lying about these matters to the FBI. And as you know, Mr. Libby was tried for these criminal violations in the U.S. District Court just recently and convicted on 4 of 5 counts, maybe 3 weeks ago. Meanwhile, it turns out that the source for Mr. Novak's column was, in fact, the Deputy Secretary of State at the time, Richard Armitage, who ironically had no brief for the administration's policy leading up to the war in Iraq. He claims further that he had no knowledge of her cover status, even though he was in the State Department, which had afforded her cover, and I believe him. I don't think he did. Neither he nor Mr. Novak have been or will be charged with any violations of law. Ms. Plame has resigned from CIA, arguing that her use to the intelligence community has been neutered by her outing, and last week she testified to Congress that Mr. Novak's 2003 column had felt like she had been hit in the gut. In other words, her livelihood was taken from her. Now, whatever you think about Ms. Plame, and she is a stunningly attractive woman who has appeared on the pages of Vanity Fair and looks like anything but an undercover officer, and her husband, and I hope I don't get, I hope I'm in a privileged environment, so I'm going to say her husband, who appears to me somewhat of a hot dog and a publicity seeker. Whatever you feel about these two, for those of us who've had intelligence experience, this is an extraordinarily important issue, and one, the point of which I don't believe, because of the way it's been handled, has resonated. As I say, at first blush, this looks like another typical partisan Washington political brouhaha, not worth the time of a U.S. attorney and the federal courts, unless one examines the underlying issue. For the first 50 years of its existence, the bulk of the spying business overseas was done by CIA spy handlers under official U.S. government cover, operating out of U.S. installations abroad. There were many reasons for this. In the USSR and Soviet bloc, we were interested in meeting Soviet or bloc officials, and official cover, i.e. working for the U.S. government, provided a means to accomplish this. Official installations could also safely and securely house the necessary communications equipment for sending messages back and forth to Washington. Finally, and most importantly, U.S. spy runners had diplomatic immunity. So if they were captured in flagrante delicto in the act of spying, they would be expelled from the country after being roughed up a bit, but they would not be shot or hanged like Nathan Hale, whose likeness was so interestingly described yesterday in our conference. I have a little Nathan Hale story, and I'll preview my next book, because I couldn't keep from referring to it. As was stated yesterday, Nathan Hale's statue sits in splendor outside the original entrance to the headquarters building in Langley, our origins, our historical spy. And that always used to bother Director Casey, who knew that Hale was a pretty poor spy. He hadn't been trained in it. He was just a patriotic young man who said, this may be one way where I can help my country. But he was so obvious that he hadn't been on the job behind enemy lines for part of a day before he came to the attention of the British. They caught him, they hanged him. Why didn't they celebrate Horatio Mulligan, said Bill Casey, who was a tremendous reader and knew about this other Yale graduate whose brother had been in the export-import business, and he ran a restaurant, and he'd been a very successful spy, part of the Committee of Foreign Correspondence that President, or I shouldn't say President, then General Washington had and funded to keep track of the British Army and Navy in New York during that period of time. And as I say, he lived to spy throughout the war and thereafter. Why don't we have a statue of Horatio Mulligan before the front gates? It was also true that Mr. Mulligan was an Irishman, which did not escape Mr. Casey's notice. So I always laughed and loved that particular story. However, since the end of the Cold War, espionage has changed radically. America's principal enemies are bands of terrorists loyal to no nation state, but often operating out of failed ones. Their mission is martyrdom by suicide bombing or assassination by roadside bomb, and their ranks have to be penetrated, if they can be, from the ground level, in the back alleys or bazaars of the Middle East, or the mosques of Hamburg, where they congregate and develop their murderous strategies. In short, access to today's principal targets will be by officers with non-official cover, called NOCs, who will most likely be Americans of Middle Eastern heritage with near-native language skills. You're not going to meet a terrorist at an embassy cocktail party or in a formal visit to your opposite number in a foreign state. Enter Valerie Plame. It is hard to believe that today's serving NOC officer was encouraged by the spectacle that surrounded her outing. If official Washington is so cavalier about the question of the identity of a serving career non-official cover official that she could be compromised mindlessly in the course of a vicious but in the end meaningless political dispute, I am not sure I would sign up for such a dangerous assignment. In fact, I'm sure I would not. And the outcome of the criminal investigation, don't you see, has done nothing to clear the air. Neither the true leaker nor the news columnist who printed the leak were ever prosecuted or punished, and the public thinks that the individual who was punished is a fall guy for the administration, just the poor guy, the only poor guy they could catch. In its most ironic aspect, this is an administration that has pushed the secrecy of its own deliberative processes and decisions to a new high, even on matters of simple personal prerogative like White House energy discussions with outsiders in the vice president's office. Yet they won't protect the identity of a career public servant whose safety and effectiveness and the safety of her principal contacts and coworkers, that's the other important point to remember. If a person serves under non-official cover, she did as an economist, her primary contacts in country X and those people who served with her will be suspect in the eyes of a foreign intelligence service that's trying to keep track of this question. And all of the safety and security of all these people depends on protection of her true identity. As I say, although this story has not yet been filmed, I think you'll have to see it to believe it. And let me just close with that. Truth is stranger than fiction.